Buddhism declined in India, but then it went on to become popular in places like China, Korea, and Japan, but especially in Southeast Asia, where it became the dominant religion. Why did Buddhism not remain popular in India? Well, again, this is in the book. Class divisions had a lot to do with it. Buddhism denied the existence of the soul. The Hindus were convinced that we have one. Buddhism appealed to the lower caste, the untouchables, the pariahs, but they did not appeal that much to the higher caste. In fact, the appeal to the lower caste was a threat to the higher caste. Now, earlier times, your authors would state that the caste system was useful and perhaps necessary. I mean, I insert my own editorial note here. To me, the caste system guaranteed that India would never develop fully as long as it was in place. Anyway, when Buddhism began to decline, Hinduism came to the forefront, and part of it was that Hinduism altered itself a little bit to allow all classes to participate in the Hindu rituals, whereas formerly the outcasts were not allowed. Well, when the lower caste was allowed in to participate in the rituals, Hinduism revived, Buddhism declined. It was slow, but eventually Hinduism became the dominant religion of the majority of Indians, while Buddhism declined. Now, part about Islam on the march. This is all in the book, this much. I mentioned last time, well, Islam had better weaponry, mounted cavalry. Also, the Islam came on the scene when India was divided. Just like the Crusaders hit the Muslim world when the Muslim world was divided. Islam came on the scene when the Indian world was divided. Eventually, though, there came another threat over another horizon when Genghis Khan and the Mongolians came over, and they did a lot to down the spread of Islam. And the Islamic people who were trying to conquer India had to spend their time fighting off Genghis Khan, or they were so weakened by Genghis Khan they could not threaten much anymore. Tamerlane was himself a Mongolian, and he conquered a lot of Indian territory before he died, as I've already mentioned. All right, we're going to fast forward, your book does, a few hundred years. The Muslim threat that began around the year 1000, 1100s to that time period, roughly, by 1497, the Muslim threat had subsided. However, up came a group called the nomadic Mughals, coming from the north, and then a new group, and I've misspelled that word, Portuguese, P-R-T-U-G-U-E-S-E, the Portuguese. They came along, but that's a subject for second semester world history. But in 1497, 5 years after Columbus discovered America, the first Portuguese sailor went around Africa and came to India. The Indians were not the least bit impressed by these scurvy, dirty, ragged sailors from Europe. But they didn't realize that these dirty, ragged sailors came from a civilization that had more on the ball than theirs did, had better weaponry, and eventually Europeans were to conquer India and force India to undergo some changes. Now, I'll jump ahead of the story a little bit. Hopefully all of you know that Great Britain once had 13 colonies in North America, and Georgia is one of the 13. And in the late 1700s, Great Britain lost all its 13 North American colonies. Well, to make up for their loss, they went to India and conquered India instead. And Lord Cornwallis, any of you heard about Lord Cornwallis? He was the yeah, you have. He was a British general who surrendered at Yorktown. They sent him with some similar, or the same army he had surrendered with, of course a lot more troops added. They sent him to India, and between Lord Cornwallis and Robert Clive, they were to conquer India and hold it until about 1947. But the British were to force India to make a whole lot of changes that in the long run has benefited India and brought India up to the modern world. But anyway, the Portuguese were to pose a new threat to India, and India was to spend its time again divided. Divided and ruled by foreigners. In other words, who were the foreigners? Among them, Islam conquered part of it, Tamerlane conquered another part, the Mughals conquered another part, and ultimately the Portuguese and eventually the British conquered later. All told, India spent much of its last 3,000 years disunited and ruled by foreigners. The book goes on to compare, and I've got it here, compare, or how it tells how the Islamic people and the Indian people got along. All told, they were not, they did not get along well. They were suspicious of each other. And here's a problem, folk, that Islam has. Islam simply does not assimilate with other cultures. Europe is finding that out right today. I mean, they've invited these Islamic people back in, or to come in, and in the case of Spain, to come back in. But they invited people in, and these people do not assimilate. They take no part in the European politics, and they're willing to siphon off European wealth, live on welfare and whatever else. And it's created a problem that Europeans wish, a lot of Europeans wishing they could get rid of. Well, why did Europe invite him in? Two reasons. Number one, Europe's population was greatly reduced as a result of 2 world wars. But what destroyed more of Europe's population, both in world wars, was Europe began extensively practicing birth control. And they had so few people that after a while, I've heard the rumors that some European governments are actually paying women, married or not, to have children, because they realize, hey, we need children. But then to make up for the shortage in labor, they invited these Islamic people in, and the Islamic people have not assimilated. Islamic people simply do not assimilate with people who are not of the Islamic faith. This is simply a simple fact. Non-Muslims were compelled to pay a tax called a jizya. Again, that word is in italics because it's a foreign word. Keep that in mind, folk, because this is what has kept non-Muslims from rising in societies where Muslims control. I think I've mentioned how that when the Muslims are in charge of a place, they won't even allow the local people who are not Muslims to ride on the back of a beast because it might put them higher up than a Muslim. They do not allow non-Muslims to wear tall hats because it might make them appear taller than Muslim. Muslim houses are expected to be so high, but non-Muslim houses are expected to be lower. You can tell a Muslim house from a non-Muslim house. Now, when I say Hinduism is polytheistic, some Hindus will insist, oh, all of our seeming many gods are really part of one God, so we're really monotheistic as you are. But Hinduism has more than 1 million deities that some of them claim that are all manifestation of one God, so they'll try to make it sound like they're monotheistic when they're talking to a monotheistic person. But basically, outsiders look on Hinduism as polytheistic, Islam monotheistic. Islam was more egalitarian, and here's the comparison, folks, I want you to make. Islam was egalitarian, Hinduism was hierarchical. In other words, this person belongs in this caste, and the next high up is another caste, and another caste. Hinduism cannot be called egalitarian. Islam, much more so. Again, Hinduism had priests, Islam had none. Very important, because this is what brought Islam in conflict with Africa also. African people had priests. Islam says everyone can go to Allah directly. I know I've mentioned this one. Muslims eat beef, Hindus do not. Indian art appears to be vulgar to Muslims. But they borrow from each other. The one group found the idea of divine kinship appealing, the Muslims. Some of the Muslims set themselves up as being gods, say, hey, we divine kingship, that's okay. Hindu warriors started using horses instead of elephants. When Hindu men saw Muslim men keep their wives in seclusion, a lot of Hindu men started doing the same thing. And the practice of sati, burning a wife burning himself to death when her husband's died, again, I've already mentioned Muslim did not change that much. The two groups hated each other and still do. They're suspicious of each other. I mean, your book tones it down a bit and simply says they're suspicious of each other. All right. Muslim conquerors found themselves copying a lot of India's caste system because it seemed like it was convenient to do so. In other words, the Muslims hadn't had that before, but they wound up, you might say, and I want to say stooping, I guess that's a word, stooping to the level of the people they conquered. All right, moving on.